from Washington, D.C.
From Bloomberg's Washington, D.C. studios to our TV and radio audiences worldwide, welcome to Balance of Power. I'm Joe Matthew. Breaking news, President Trump considering options now to extend his influence over the Fed. A Bloomberg News scoop just hours after the president moved to fire Fed Governor Lisa Cook.
An infraction, and she can't have an infraction, especially that infraction, because she's in charge of, if you think about it, mortgages, and we need people that are 100% above board.
Cook says she will not leave, her lawyer promising to sue today amid big questions over whether Cook's removal is in fact within the president's power. Former Fed members raising flags now as the president's moves against the Fed enter uncharted territory.
This is not about an individual governor. This is really an unprecedented attack on the independence of the Federal Reserve as an institution.
We'll get reaction to the turmoil from former US Treasury Secretary Larry Summers up ahead. Plus, Danny Blanchflower, professor of economics at Dartmouth College, will join us with his economic insights. And President Trump rallying Indiana state Republicans in Washington today in his latest pressure campaign to redraw congressional maps ahead of the midterms, while he threatens legal action against California for doing the same. We'll have more when Democratic Congressman Sam Liccardo of California joins us later this hour. But we begin this evening with the latest in the standoff between President Trump and the Fed. According to a new Bloomberg report out in the last hour, the Trump administration is now weighing its options to extend its influence over the Fed's 12 regional banks, a move that would extend President Trump's reach well beyond personnel appointments here in Washington. With more on the very latest here, Bloomberg's Kate Davidson, who helps to steer our Fed coverage in Washington. Kate, an unprecedented day here for the president, beginning with his attempt to fire a Fed governor. This is a whole new level. What would it mean for his influence over the central bank?
Sure. So if the president is successful in his bid to oust Governor Cook, that would give him another opening to another vacancy to appoint someone on the Fed board in Washington. There are 7 governors on the board, and then that includes the chairman. Right now, there are 2 Republican appointees. Trump has nominated a third, and that nomination is pending because we had a Fed governor resign in early August, Governor Adriana Kugler. Now, if there's another governor who steps down, 4 out of the 7, that would give him a majority on the Fed board, which would, potentially mean he has 4 individuals that would presumably or could potentially support his bid for lower interest rates. I mean, that is the big push that he's been making throughout the year. Yes. And we heard former Vice Chair Lil Brainerd talking about it on Bloomberg TV earlier, that it's not really about Governor Cook. It seems to be part of this bigger effort to apply pressure on the Fed. Yeah.
What would it mean, though, to reach beyond Washington and into these regions?
Sure. So if you had a majority on the Fed board, the board operates independently from the 12 banks. They're run by boards of directors. They choose their own leaders. But essentially, one idea that's gotten a lot of heightened attention today after Lisa Cook's firing is this process where the board has to reauthorize every 5 years the 12 presidents of the regional banks. And so one concern now, and an idea that I think administration officials are aware of this authority, is that if you had 4 people on the board who didn't want to vote to reauthorize some of these regional presidents, thought that they either weren't doing a good job, or maybe you didn't like that they weren't supporting your calls for lower rates, that maybe you could exert some pressure there, and appeal to board members that were aligned with your views on that issue. I mean, this is all, it's a bit hypothetical. It's down the line, but this is something that administration officials are thinking about and looking at.
Your team did great work today, Kate. Thank you for bringing this to us. Bloomberg's Kate Davidson with The Breaker. You can find more on the terminal and online. And for a closer look into the administration's actions, Bloomberg's Wendy Benjaminson also with us here in Bloomberg's Washington bureau. Wendy, if the president pulls this off, does he become the de facto chair of the Fed?
In a sense, yes. I mean, he is pushing his influence into every part of government. I mean, literally from paving the streets of the District of Columbia with new asphalt to setting monetary policy with his own people in place. And this, he has been forced 2 days in a row, not forced, but he has been put in a position 2 days in a row to explain that he's not a dictator out loud. He has said, and not in response to a question, he just says, I am not a dictator. And yet then he goes on to, as Kate explained, like to take control of the Fed board and to take control of labor statistics. And it goes on and on, like I said, all the way down to paving the streets of D.C.
He added yesterday that many people think they might like a dictator, even though he doesn't want to be one. But it was an interesting experience today, going over 3 hours with his cabinet before live cameras and microphones. He did not mention the name Lisa Cook until he was asked by Bloomberg's Anne-Marie Hordern.
That's right.
Why would he initiate this fight last night and not pursue it with any talking points today?
Well, I think he probably figures he has done this now. He has moved to fire her.
Okay.
The ball was in her court. She came back immediately and said, basically, try it, buddy, you know. And she's hired prominent defense attorney Abby Lowell, who's already filing a lawsuit to stop this. And I think Lowell is in probably pretty good shape because the Supreme Court has indicated that the Fed is different than the other agencies that he's been able to fire people from, that it is supposed to be independent. But, but he just wants to, yes, I think this is what he wants to do, is exert this power.
Well, we're going to find out together, Wendy. It's great to have you with us. Wendy Benjaminson here in Washington. As we now turn for his unique view on balance of power to Larry Summers, the former U.S. Treasury Secretary in the Clinton administration, of course, now Bloomberg Wall Street Week contributor. Mr. Secretary, welcome back to Bloomberg TV and radio. Will we look back on this day as the day that Fed independence died?
It's too early to know. And, you know, we've seen a lot that has been threatening to Fed independence. An unprecedented degree of rhetorical attack publicly from the president on the Fed, involvement of the president in criticism of the Fed over a relatively minor matter, the construction of a building, announcements by the president of various kinds with respect to the composition of the Federal Reserve. So I don't think there's any question that we're facing the most severe challenge to Fed independence in the last 2 generations. And I don't think there's any
safe
question.
To say this is the beginning of the politicization of the Fed.
Well, I think that, I don't know that I'd want to call it the beginning. There have been various things that have happened in the past, but I would say it's the gravest, most extensive politicization of the Fed in more than 50 years. And what we know from experience around the world and from our own historical experience, for example, with Richard Nixon and the then chairman of the Fed, Arthur Burns, is that when monetary policy is politicized and when it is perceived as politicized, everybody expects higher inflation. And then that higher expected inflation, as wage earners bargain, as price setters set prices, becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy, and you get higher inflation. And if you want to do something about it, then when everybody's expecting higher inflation and pushing prices way up, if you don't validate that by printing money, you end up getting a recession. So it makes it harder and worse for everybody. And that's why most countries in the world have moved to having institutions based on independent central banking. And you saw a bit of market response. It wasn't a dramatic market response last night, but it was a revealing one. You saw short-term interest rates go down because people thought, gee, if it's so political, the Fed's going to cut more. You saw long-term interest rates go up because people thought we're headed for more inflation. And you saw the dollar go down because even though you could earn a higher interest rate on the dollar, market judgment was that it was going to be a less valuable currency over time because of all the money that was going to be printed by a political Fed. So it was a sign that we were looking more like an emerging market country. And I think that's the way this is going to be read very broadly over time. And if we know anything, it's that these things don't happen smoothly. It's like Hemingway said, how do you go bankrupt? First slowly, then quickly. And if we lose our credibility, if at a certain point our credibility tips over, only takes decades to grow a forest, but it takes only an hour to burn one down. And credibility is a bit like that. And we're putting ours at risk. And it's made worse by a couple of things. It's made worse by the fact that the president's proposals for monetary policy are outside of the reasonable range of debate. You can argue as to whether we should cut rates 50 basis points or 100 basis points. There is no one outside of those politically attentive to the president who defends the idea that we should cut interest rates to anything like the 1% that the president has talked about. No one. That's not a serious idea. And by the way, I just have to say this. Is it really this president who is saying things that don't turn out to be exactly accurate on a real estate related loan application as being the end of the world? That is a sin of which the president has stood accused on many, many occasions, has been found guilty by courts, has engaged in settlements, has paid fines. And so if somehow misleading statements on loan applications are disqualifying, I think that that's a brush that should paint very, very broadly.
Secretary, the current Treasury Secretary, Scott Bessent, said today in the president's cabinet meeting, the Fed's independence comes from a political arrangement between itself and the American public. Having the public's trust, he said, is the only thing that gives it credibility. Lisa Cook is going to fight this. The lawsuit is coming today. How important will it be for her to win this lawsuit on a precedent-setting level to maintain that credibility?
Look, I don't think we have yet had access to all the facts. I don't think the president has access to all the facts. And that's why jumping to any conclusion without any sort of process, without any sort of fact finding was, I think, completely inappropriate. So I don't feel in a position to judge the results of lawsuits, but I can judge the process. And I have to say, I don't understand quite what Secretary Bessent was saying. The view that previous administrations have had is that the independence of the Fed is in part reflected in statute, that it reports to the Congress, that it is not part of the executive branch, what the Supreme Court recognized when it distinguished the Fed from other agencies with respect to the president's ability to hire and fire. So in part, it's rooted in law, and in part, it's rooted in tradition. Secretary Rubin and I remember very well, told President Clinton that it was our advice to him that engaging in public debate with the Fed was a fool's game because the Fed wouldn't listen. And so short-term interest rates wouldn't be changed very much, but the markets would listen as credibility was lost and long-term interest rates would rise. And that's why we have an established tradition of which Secretary Bessent has endorsed very recently of administrations not engaging on the question of monetary policy and how interest rates should be set and at what level they should be set. But we have an administration that is disregarding the superstructure of norms that has really been what has made our democracy and our economy so strong for decades. This is of a piece with sending the FBI to former officials' homes, with threatening people with criminal prosecutions. And I think over time it runs very, very substantial risks for our national economy.
Secretary, I'm out of time. I just want to know, to the extent that you understand it, can Jay Powell keep Lisa Cook employed as long as he thinks it's correct? Is he the one who controls her paycheck?
I don't think so. I'm not.
So Donald Trump can cut off her paycheck.
I'm not an expert on the legalisms, but remember that whereas the Deputy Secretary of State reports to the Secretary of State, the governors of the Federal Reserve are not subservient to the chairman and don't report to the chairman. So I think this is something that will be worked out in court.
Fascinating conversation. We wanted to bring you with Larry Summers, the former Treasury Secretary in the Clinton administration. Bloomberg Wall Street Week contributor. Mr. Secretary, thank you as ever. Coming up, how the markets are watching President Trump's latest pressure on the Fed. We'll discuss the economic impact with Danny Blanchflower of Dartmouth College. But first, how lawmakers are watching all of this unfold. We'll discuss with Democratic Congressman Sam Liccardo of California. That's next on Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio. It's Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio. I'm Joe Matthew. Thanks for joining us as we learn more about President Trump's increasing pressure campaign on the Fed with the new Bloomberg scoop that the administration is reviewing options for exerting ever more influence over the Federal Reserve's 12 regional banks. We want to get insight into how Capitol Hill is watching all this unfold as lawmakers prepare to return to Washington. With us now for his perspective, Democratic Congressman Sam Liccardo of California. Importantly, a member of the House Financial Services Committee, so he's got a front row seat to this. And Congressman, I want to welcome you back to Bloomberg TV and radio. We started the day with unprecedented news that the president was aiming to fire a Federal Reserve governor in Lisa Cook. Bloomberg News now moving the needle even further to show that he's trying to exert influence potentially on the dozen regional banks. When does this end, and when does the market start to doubt the credibility of the central bank?
Well, I think that's already starting to happen. Look, it's not a secret to this market or to anybody in Congress from either party that this is an erratic president that is seeking to remake the Federal Reserve, which has long been the pillar of the global economy. He wants to remake it into his erratic image, and that's deeply disconcerting for an awful lot of folks who depend on rational decision-making when it comes to monetary policy. We've got a president who changes his mind every hour about what the tariffs ought to be, whether a particular company is either preferred or pariah, whether it's TikTok or Intel. Countries are either your friend or enemy, depending on whoever's the latest, highest bidder. This is not the way monetary policy is supposed to be made. We want, and I think the market wants, fairly consistent, rational, predictable decision-making about interest rates.
If this does turn out to be true, the allegations that Lisa Cook tried to get preferential tax treatment on a second home that she claimed to be a primary residence. And we should note, by the way, there are no charges that have been filed. The Department of Justice is in the throes of a criminal investigation. If that, in fact, turned out to be the case, does that justify her firing?
Oh, in my view, certainly the president can fire a Federal Reserve governor for cause under the statute.
Okay.
And if someone's committed fraud, that would be for cause. But there's a process for determining that by an impartial fact finder. You know, when the president of the United States was accused of defrauding lenders, as he was in 2024, and he was actually found liable for it, he had the benefit of being able to present evidence and obviously confront those who presented evidence against him, and obviously have a judge that made that finding that he was liable, and then had, of course, an appellate court that upheld that finding. So far, Lisa Cook has had none of that, merely the accusation. And when, the difference between for cause and at will is a really important distinction in the law. It doesn't mean that the president can just fire anybody willy-nilly. It means you actually have a process for determining, did this person commit the prohibited conduct? I don't have a problem with firing somebody for cause if you've determined that they really did defraud. But we just don't know that. I don't know that, and I don't think the president knows it either.
Well, it would be a first if that happened. We talked this morning, Congressman, on Bloomberg with Lael Brainerd, the former Fed vice chair, former director of the National Economic Council in the Biden administration, talked about the president's move here, what she had to say specifically about the way it would impact thoughts within the Fed itself. Let's listen.
This is not about an individual governor. This is really an unprecedented attack on the independence of the Federal Reserve as an institution. There is nobody in the Federal Open Markets Committee, the Monetary Policy Setting Committee, that can't be thinking, well, what does this mean for me?
What does this mean for me, Congressman? If the president pulls this off and gets a majority on the board here, never mind reaching further to the regional banks, what's going to happen? We get interest rates at zero?
Yeah, I think we should expect a lot higher inflation. Look, it's been the case from time immemorial that every president has wanted higher growth and wanted lower interest rates and wanted them faster. And that's probably true for lots of folks in Congress, too. And if you allow for this kind of politicization of decision making, you're going to see a lot of federal governors who are simply going to push in a race to the bottom on interest rates. And while that might feel good in the short run, there's going to be a lot of long-term pain when it comes to inflation. And the entire world is going to feel those impacts.
I don't know if you talked to the chairman of the House Financial Services Committee, Congressman, but will there be a congressional answer to this, a hearing, an investigation, or nothing?
I haven't spoke to the chair. And look, I hope that there will be people of good conscience in both parties who will be able to stand up and say, regardless of which party's in charge, there's a reason why we need an independent Fed, just like there's a reason why we need independent data gatherers at the Bureau of Labor Statistics when we're reporting things like inflation and unemployment, and why we need independent boards and Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac. The fact that this president is really undermining any independence in any of these institutions is deeply disconcerting to lots of folks out there in the market who are looking for objective, sensible decisions.
Ranking member Maxine Waters called this authoritarianism. Do you agree?
Well, this is perhaps one of many indicia one might look to when we talk about authoritarianism. I could think of a few others that are probably more obvious. But look, I'm deeply concerned about how this president regards this Constitution and how willing he is to step over every boundary, whether it's legal or it's simply a norm. We've never seen a president fire a Federal Reserve governor before. This is deeply disconcerting, I think, to everybody who's concerned about economic growth and stability in this country.
I'm glad you could come back to talk to us, Congressman. We'll see you back here in Washington. That's Sam Liccardo of California. Thanks, as always, for the insights. Coming up on Balance of Power, markets are watching President Trump's latest pressure on the Fed very closely. But what are the larger economic impacts? We're going to dive into it with Danny Blanchflower, economics professor at Dartmouth College. That's coming up next on Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio.
President Trump has been talking about firing officials and taking greater control over the Fed. Now he's actually trying to do that. What does that mean for the Fed? It tips the balance from a fairly balanced and nuanced Fed towards a dovish majority.
I don't think what happens with Fed Governor Cook in the, between now and the September meeting is going to change the outcome of the September meeting.
We should stop fixating on rate cuts, what this means for rate cuts. I think, what is this going to do for the longer end of the curve? I think that's what the market's got to start thinking about.
The markets are not as upset about it as if some other president were doing it, and I think the markets will absorb it.
It's Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio. I'm Joe Matthew. Insights from analysts this morning on Bloomberg surveillance on Bloomberg TV, talking about what they're looking for in the markets following President Trump's announcement that he is moving to fire Fed Governor Lisa Cook. For a closer look at how Wall Street responded, we turn now to power moves with Bloomberg's Romaine Bostick, live from World Headquarters in New York. Romaine, we were just having a conversation with Larry Summers, who pointed to some of the gyrations in interest rates that we saw today, but the stock market once again whistling past the graveyard here.
Yeah, it's a bit of a tale of two cities, Joe. I think we came into today with the expectation we were going to see a big sell-off in equity markets. And to be sure, equity markets did open lower, but only fractionally so. The numbers you see on the screen, though, not only gains on the day, but more or less the highs of the day, up about 0.4%, 0.3%, pretty much across the board here. And that is a market, at least an equity market, that at least for right now feels that corporate fundamentals will continue to hold up and will continue to support valuations. But something that you've been talking about and the other shows on Bloomberg have been talking about all day, and something that Larry Summers alluded to, is what actually happened today in the bond market. And that was really a tale of short-term risk versus long-term risk. You saw yields on short-term treasuries. Let's just take a 2-year or 5-year. Those yields dropped. That means basically people were willing to buy those durations. However, longer-term yields, well, that moved in the opposite direction, a sign that people weren't as willing to buy those longer duration yields, and in some cases even sell them off. And this is basically a market that's basically saying that in the short term, we think some of the issues with regards to tariffs, the issues with regards to Fed independence, and the issues with regards to interest rates, that does not necessarily pose a short-term risk. But longer term, where do you think this is actually going to go, Joe? Do you actually think that the direction of the Fed, the direction of tariffs, and overall the direction of policies coming out of Washington will actually be accretive to this economy and, more importantly, to this market? And this so-called steepening of that yield curve, at least historically, has always been a signal that market participants are much more reticent about the long term than they are the short.
Fascinating. Bloomberg's Romaine Bostick with the readout. We thank you so much, Romaine. Joining us now for further insights into the broader economic impact of President Trump's plans here is Danny Blanchflower, economics professor at Dartmouth College. Professor, it's always great to have you on Bloomberg TV and radio. Great. Thank you for joining. I've got to get into a couple things here with you, but I just asked Larry Summers before you joined us, if we look back at this day as the day Fed independence died, what do you think?
Well, I don't think it's actually died. I mean, clearly there are serious attempts going on. But I do think, and I've always had in my head this kind of view of things, that markets stop policymakers doing stupid stuff. And obviously there are suggestions that the president is going to do various things. But I just go back to the UK in 1997. Gordon Brown came into office, the new Labour government, and the markets were worried about what he might do. And 3 days in, he declared the Bank of England to be independent. So this is something in the opposite direction. And what happened, it's very relevant to what the comments a few minutes ago were. What happened was that long-run borrowing costs for 2 decades nearly fell dramatically because the markets liked that independence. So I think the move today in the long run is exactly what you'd expect. The Fed can have an impact on the short run and maybe do things that it shouldn't do. But in the end, the market will set the price for mortgages because the markets will speak. So obviously we will see what comes, but I think at your peril, do you mess with the markets? And the markets will have their day. And we can only look back again to Liz Truss, who made a market move on Friday afternoon at 3 o'clock, and the markets collapsed and the Bank of England had to intervene by noon on Monday. So we will see. The markets are sanguine, but if you do stupid things, then the markets will respond. And in a sense, what we've seen with the president is he has actually, in his tariff things, responded to what the markets do when they didn't like things. So I don't know that it's the end, but it's certainly the end of the beginning. And Larry's right. Markets don't like gyrations. Markets don't like interference because there is a benefit of having an independent central bank.
All right. Well, you just said a lot. And I don't know what happened to that head of lettuce, Danny, but let's say President Trump pulls this off. Yeah, I believe it did. Let's say President Trump pulls this off. He fires Lisa Cook. He starts to turn the screws on the 12 regional banks. I can ask you what's going to happen to the 10-year or the 30, but where are our mortgage rates a year from now?
Well, if he does those things, if you learn from what Gordon Brown did, then you might find at the short end that the interest rates fall and the mortgage price rises as people's expectations of inflation start to rise. So that's the big story. You can mess at the short end, but what do you do at the long end? The one thing we should be aware, I think, and say to your listeners, I always thought this when I was at the Bank of England. I always thought that the central bankers are there, they're independent, they have this power over the markets, because the suggestion is that they can do better than politicians can, because they'll mess when they shouldn't. Policy, I mean, the Fed committee has to be mindful of that. They're not elected officials. They're only, in a sense, they're only there because they are shown to do better than politicians who are inherently going to try and interfere. And that's where we will be. And markets are going to be sitting and watching, but they haven't moved that much. Perhaps because they don't think, as you said, that this is the end of the independence. I don't think it is.
Well, interesting. So, okay, stock market says, call me back when it matters, Danny. Tariffs, 50% tariffs on India take effect tomorrow. Will that matter?
Well, the answer is to this point, it clearly potentially will matter. But the question is, I mean, in a sense, markets don't seem to think that that's going to be in place that long, and that it's likely to change. What's the taco comments? So obviously markets perhaps have surprised us, but partly because there's a history that Trump responds to bad moves in the markets. So I don't think it's something that I would have predicted, that markets have been so positive. But I mean, the story that I always learned as a policymaker is that markets don't like uncertainty. Policymakers don't like uncertainty. You have to make a forecast. And if you make a forecast with uncertain world, it's very hard to do that. And the obvious thing is that firms don't invest when there's huge amounts of uncertainty, particularly as to what borrowing costs will be in the future and what future rates of return will be. So stand steady. But as I say, things can move quickly, as they did in the UK over a 24-hour period. Hopefully that won't happen, and we'll see. I mean, obviously the question is with Lisa Cook, does the president, he's announced that he'll fire her, but the question is, can he? I don't know that he can without a lot of litigation, and he may end up going to the Supreme Court, and that won't happen quickly.
It won't at all. You've told me before, Danny, that I would have failed your economics class, and I'm taking you at your word there. So give us a sense of what we should be looking for here in the way that distrust in the Federal Reserve would manifest itself in the markets. Is it all about long-term rates?
Well, I think it has to be. I mean, I start in a couple of weeks' time teaching a class for Dartmouth seniors, many of whom are going to come to Wall Street. And it's called Financial Stability. It's about financial markets, and it's about shocks to markets. And trying to understand that. I think what we are going to be in a world of, and Bloomberg is really good at covering this, the question is whether markets are going to be surprised by things. And to some extent, the president's behavior hasn't actually been that of a surprise. Make an announcement, back off from it. Make another announcement, back off from it. So my story is going to be markets don't like surprises. We will see if there's an intervention and whether that is actually meaningful. I mean, in the other sense is that the Bank of the United States, the Central Bank of the United States, is not on its own. There are other central banks who will see this and actually respond in kind. If you see the Central Bank in the United States doing something, then you may well end up having to respond in a global market. The exchange rate may move. So I think we're sitting here in a very uncertain world, but that's not good for markets, and it's not good for policymakers. And we will see. But I think if you were sitting on the Fed trying to make a decision, you would be very nervous right now. And I think other people sort of understand, in a way, that these policymakers are doing, many of them are taking a job that relative to what their previous job was or the job that they're going to go to, they're relatively low paid. And so this is something they do as a public service. And it doesn't sound like this is a really very nice place to be.
Boy, no, it doesn't, Professor. It's great to have you back. I hope the fishing's been good this summer. That's Danny Blanchflower, economics professor at Dartmouth College. I thought you'd say that. Now, as we continue to explore the economic impact of the president's pressure across the board on the Fed, What are the legal restrictions surrounding the president's push to fire Fed Governor Lisa Cook? It's the other side of the story that we want to discuss with Bloomberg's Erik Larson. He's with us live from World Headquarters in New York with the details. Erik, no one seems to have real answers other than this is going to go to court. It might go to the Supreme Court before we understand the status here and the level of authority that the president has to fire a Fed governor.
Well, you're absolutely right. We are expecting a lawsuit. Cook did say she was going to sue. That could happen very soon. There's never been a case like this before, so that's why we really don't know exactly how this could play out. We do know that federal law underpinning the Fed says that a president can dismiss a Fed official, but only for cause. And there's never really been a case like that before, so this could all boil down to whether these mortgage fraud allegations, if they're proven, amount to a for cause violation that could allow Trump to fire her. A lawsuit would likely say that, she hasn't actually been investigated formally or charged with any wrongdoing. And so how can this be enough cause for her to be fired?
Yeah. Bill Pulte fed this to the Department of Justice, which opened a criminal investigation into these allegations of mortgage fraud. To be clear, charges haven't been filed. The review, as you just said, isn't even done. Erik, do we know what the timeline is?
No, we don't. We know that Ed Martin, a DOJ official, has said that these allegations should be looked into, but there isn't, as far as we know, an actual formal investigation open as of yet. But clearly they are considering looking into it. And that could take some time. And it looks like President Trump wants this firing to happen immediately. So there's clearly a disconnect between how quickly the president wants to move on this firing and how long the legal process might take to play out. We've seen so many court challenges over President Trump's various actions and policy initiatives, and a lot of them do get expedited. And as you said, this very likely could go to the Supreme Court. And we know that Trump has a 6-3 conservative majority there, and a lot of his other initiatives, including firings, have gotten the green light from the court, from the justices on that, but never one over this for-cause issue. So it really will boil down to arguments about that little legalese there.
That's for sure. Really important part of the story, Erik. Thank you. Bloomberg's Erik Larson with the legal angle in New York. Coming up, the latest details surrounding the country's spreading redistricting battle. An important update today in Washington. We'll have details. We'll also turn back to President Trump's continued pressure on the Fed as we assemble our political panel. That's next on Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio. I'm Joe Matthew. We'll turn back in a moment to our top story. President Trump's move to oust Fed Governor Lisa Cook and additional pressure on the Fed when we assemble our political panel next. First, some of the other stories we're watching in today's Power Brief. Promising data moving Eli Lilly's experimental obesity pill a step closer to potential approval. The second of two pivotal trials finding the drug helped patients lose an average of 9.6% of their body weight. Patients given the highest dose lost around 21 pounds, saw significant improvements in blood sugar levels. This is significant as results from a separate trial earlier this month disappointed investors who had been expecting greater weight loss. Lower rates of side effects sent the stock lower at the time. Today, the news sent Lilly shares up over 5%. To a Bloomberg exclusive, the Department of Justice's Criminal Division is digging into United Health Group's prescription management services, as well as how it reimburses its own doctors under an ongoing probe into the firm's operations. Previously unreported areas of the probe show that scrutiny is broader than was known and goes beyond an inquiry into possible Medicare fraud. United Health or its executives are not accused of wrongdoing here. The existence of a probe does not mean that charges will be filed either, but the broader security could complicate the matter for the company. And Politico reporting President Trump is meeting today with Indiana state lawmakers at the White House as the administration builds pressure to take action on redistricting that favors Republicans. Among those on the trip, Indiana's Speaker of the House and his daughter, who works as an assistant to White House Press Secretary Caroline Leavitt. Back in Indiana, redistricting is far from certain, though, with some key state Republicans expressing hesitation over the efforts. This as Republican redistricting gets a setback in Utah, where a judge ruled lawmakers must redraw the state's congressional maps, determining the Republican-led state assembly ignored a 2020 voter-approved initiative meant to end partisan gerrymandering. A map adopted in 2021 splits the Democratic stronghold around Salt Lake City into 4 districts that favor Republicans. Republican officials are expected to appeal that decision. All right, let's assemble our panel. This evening's panel includes Matt Bennett, Executive Vice President for Public Affairs at Third Way, our Democratic strategist, alongside Republican strategist Sarah Chamberlain, President, CEO of the Republican Main Street Partnership. It's great to see you both. I'd like to ask, while it's fresh in the air here, about your thoughts on this redistricting spiral, according to some. Matt, maybe if you're a Democrat, you see Indiana as the next stop on the road here after Texas. Is this going to be open season?
I mean, it could be, and there's Missouri is talking about it, and Florida's talking about it, and Ohio, and it could be really, really bad as if every state starts opening this thing up. But we got to remember how this all started and why this is happening. Donald Trump did this. No Democrat was looking to do anything like the redistricting that we're seeing. Nobody in California wanted to do it. Gavin Newsom, who's running the redistricting effort in California, had no interest in doing this until the Trump White House started it with Texas. But nobody is interested in unilateral disarmament either. There aren't many things that unify my party right now, but this is one of them.
Well, it's interesting, Sarah, and I don't know if the Main Street Partnership has an official stand on each state or just on redistricting in general here, but where are the members on this?
They're pretty much in lockstep with what Trump is trying to do. I mean, this helps us hopefully expand in the House. But the one thing we're really working on is making sure, especially in Texas, who wins these primaries.
Right.
That's going to be a big piece of what Main Street does. We've already endorsed 3 of the candidates.
Okay, sure.
So that's important.
There's something called dummy mandering, where it doesn't work out the way you plan.
Yes.
So that's going to be your mission.
That can happen. I mean, we already have some Republicans that join more with the Democrats than with the Republicans. We want to make sure we don't get any more of them.
Sure.
So we're really heavily involved with Texas. Unfortunately, in California, if it goes through, it will knock out some of the best Republican Main Street Partnership members.
Yeah.
And that's really too bad.
Is that true, Matt? Because that could tip the scale in the House of Representatives.
It could. And to Sarah's point, one of the problems with this, and it's really the problem in our politics at the moment, is that the people we keep replacing are the most moderate members. They're the people in the swing districts. They're the people most eager to try to find real solutions. They're the least orthodox in their views and the least extreme. And if this gerrymander happens on both sides, both for Texas and California and elsewhere, you could see loss of more of the moderates, more of the kind of business-friendly people that viewers of this show would want to see in Congress.
And that's why I want to keep reminding people, please vote in primaries. Because in these gerrymandered districts, the primary fight is the most important fight. Because in the general election, because it's gerrymandered, that Republican or Democrat is going to win, let's make sure it's the right Republican that wins.
While we're talking about this, we saw kind of the opening of a new front against the big, beautiful bill by Abigail Spanberger, the Democrat running for governor in Virginia. This is a new ad, just came out, targeting her opponent's support for the president's big, beautiful bill. Here's a taste.
What does she say about Trump's bad budget bill?
The bill, as you know now, there's so many great things.
What? The Trump budget raises healthcare costs, raises mortgages, raises the price of electricity and gas. You pay more, so billionaires can pay less.
Matt, you and your colleagues at Third Way have been busy writing messaging for Democrats who are going to be in fights like that. Does that mirror what you're looking for?
Yeah. Abigail Spanberger is about one of the best messengers we have in Democratic politics. And get ready to see that ad over and over and over.
All over the country.
The next 18 months. I mean, that is going to be the argument. $50 billion cut from Medicaid, 12 million people losing their health care, costs going up all over the place, including on energy, in order to give tax cuts to rich people. That's what that bill is. There's going to be some counter messaging from Republicans, but as we saw after the passage of the Affordable Care Act, when an idea takes hold about a bill that is bad, as it did with the ACA initially, turned around eventually, that it's really tough for the party in power in that midterm. We got killed, 63 seats lost. I don't know if it's going to happen this time, but it's going to hurt them.
Well, that's a good taste of what you've been cooking up at Third Way, and you just saw the ad. Surely Republicans and the Main Street Partnership has a response that's been crystallized as well.
We will be countering your ad with all the good things that are in this bill, like no tax on overtime, no tax on tips. There's a lot of things that the American people do like in this legislation. We'll be combating your commercials with our own commercials, talking about all the things. And we are testing that now, so we know that people are very supportive of.
That's underway right now.
Yes.
Do you worry about people sitting at home and seeing all these ads back to back and just getting confused?
Yes, I do occasionally.
How do you break through that?
It's very difficult to break through that, to be honest. But we keep trying and keep messaging them in different ways to try to get them to understand this is the bill. The Democrats, I will give you, have been out front of the Republicans so far with this bill. But we will catch up and we'll start our messaging in September and we'll combat everything that Matt's doing over there.
Wait, it's going to be quite a fight. I want to ask you both about Lisa Cook, because this was the big story today, certainly for our viewers and listeners here at Bloomberg. Will the president be the first to fire a Fed governor?
He's trying.
He sure is.
But look, it's going to be up to the courts. She's pushing back, which I think is exactly right, is obviously illegal to try to fire her. She should not resign and she should not be fired.
Why is it obvious?
Because the Supreme Court has basically made it clear that this is not a thing the president can do. The president has a lot of authority to fire people throughout the federal government, but the court carved out the Fed for very good reason. A lot of your prior guests on the show have been talking about why it's so important to have an independent Fed, and Democrats are going to fight as hard as we can. Now, we don't have any tools to fight back other than her lawsuit, but we're united in support of her.
You've got a number of members on financial services. Main Street is close to the Fed, including the chairman in this case, Mike Flood, your chair of the partnership. If this turns out to be true, if there are in fact charges, she's convicted of mortgage fraud, should she be fired?
She has to go, absolutely. You cannot have someone on the Fed board that has committed mortgage fraud.
Are you worried that we're talking about this in the meantime? We're learning about a federal investigation in the news.
No, not worried about it at all. I do agree that the court will make the decision, but if she has committed fraud, she needs to be removed.
There is a credibility
that should be a
question,
no-brainer.
though, right?
A huge credibility.
This market could get worried about.
Well, I mean, if she has done 2 mortgages and she's lied on those, how can she really sit on the Fed board?
Yeah.
I think most people, if that's proven to be accurate, will unite and call for her to step away. I realize it will be this court's decision, but I hope they do remove her if she is found to have done both those.
In our remaining moment, Matt, Danny Blanchflower painted the picture of how this could go wrong. Sure, you get to fire Lisa Cook, you take control of a couple of regional banks, and long-term interest rates could actually rise to the point where we've got some serious issues just in time for the midterms.
Oh, yeah. I mean, careful what you wish for if you're the White House. If you get control of the Fed, then you own the whole economy. Basically, you own it anyway, politically.
Yeah.
And if the Fed starts doing the things he wants to do, as Larry Summers said, trying to raise rates, cut rates by a point, I mean, we're going to have inflation that is out of control and bond yields going vertical. Things could get very bad.
We could be playing some of this back no matter what happens.
Right.
Matt Bennett and Sarah Chamberlain, this is a great panel and a great conversation. Thank you both. And check out the Washington Edition newsletter to catch up on all the news today. Find it on the terminal and online. There's a lot to unpack. Thank you for joining us on Balance of Power. We'll see you back here tomorrow on Bloomberg TV and Radio.